The transmission crackled as Zaruna stood in the darkened chamber of the Solvrian warship, her pale hands resting lightly on the smooth, obsidian console. The hum of the engine reverberated through the ship's metallic bones, an almost comforting reminder of her place in this vast, indifferent empire. She had been raised in the rigidity of the Solvrian way, loyal, efficient, and without question. She was a soldier and envoy of her people's will, and in her youth, she had believed that was enough, that perhaps this was all there was. But today there was an uncomfortable tremor in her chest, a subtle but persistent ache that gnawed at her, like the edges of a rusted blade. It was a reminder of the mission ahead. "Approaching target coordinates," came the voice through the transmission, its tone cool and devoid of emotion. "Deploying blockade in 15 minutes. Human resistance will be neutralized as scheduled." Zaruna's eyes narrowed, though no one could see the subtle shift of her expression. The message was direct, final. There would be no room for mercy. The humans on the outpost, a small, insignificant outpost at the edge of the galaxy, were irrelevant to the grand machinations of the Solvrian Empire. A blip, a brief interruption in the conquest that had brought her people to the precipice of intergalactic dominance. Yet there was one human on that outpost who had been more than a simple obstacle. Mark. The thought of him caught her off guard, but she shoved it aside. She had a duty to her people. She had sworn an oath, and nothing, not even the small, fleeting memories of a human she had come to know, could alter that path. The transport bay doors hissed open behind her, the sound of distant footfalls breaking through her moment of reverie. She turned to face the newcomer, who was one of her most trusted officers. "Commander Zaruna," the officer said with a salute, his voice just a touch too formal. "We are ready for departure." She nodded and stepped away from the console, making her way to the transport vessel that would take her to the surface of the planet below. The ship's thin walls hummed softly as the crew adjusted the course. Zaruna's fingers twitched at her side, an unconscious movement that belied the weight of the situation. This was not like other missions. This one was different. As the transport glided through the atmosphere, Zaruna glanced out the window. The planet below was a chaotic blend of desert and urban sprawl, the signs of human industry clashing with the unforgiving terrain. A stark contrast to the serene and controlled worlds of the Solvrian Empire, where everything was ordered, precise. Yet there was something about the disarray of this human world that was strangely captivating. "You all right, Commander?" The voice behind her broke her thoughts once again. It was the young officer who had spoken earlier, his tone tentative. "Fine," Zaruna replied curtly, though even she could hear the crack in her own voice. "Just thinking." "Thinking?" The officer chuckled lightly, though it was clear he was trying to mask his nervousness. "You know, I've read all the reports. The humans are resilient. I'm sure the blockade will go as planned. But, I've also heard stories about their ingenuity." He paused as if weighing whether or not to continue. "Some say they're like roaches. No matter how many times you try to squash them, they always find a way to survive." Zaruna raised an eyebrow, her lips quirking in the slightest of smiles. "Is that supposed to make me feel better, Lieutenant? Are you suggesting I'll need to bring a can of bug spray?" The officer blinked, taken aback by her lightheartedness, but she could see the faintest hint of relief in his eyes. She knew the tension was high on all sides. Even the most seasoned officers were uneasy about dealing with the unpredictable humans. Their resistance had proven irritatingly effective in the past, but Zaruna had seen far worse, and she had dealt with it with cold, ruthless efficiency. "Just trying to lighten the mood," the officer said, though his attempt seemed to fall flat. "I hear the humans have this thing called humor. They find it funny when things go wrong." He chuckled again, this time with more conviction. "Sounds like a dangerous habit," Zaruna mused. "I'm sure I could find some use for it. In case the Empire ever runs out of weapons, we could just bomb them with bad jokes." Her response caught him off guard, and for a brief moment, the young officer allowed himself a laugh. A quick, nervous burst that cut through the tension like a laser through fog. Zaruna couldn't help but feel a small spark of satisfaction at his reaction. She wasn't a fool. She knew how to manage her crew. Humor had its place, even in the darkest of times. After all, it had been one of the first things Mark had introduced her to when they had met. The transport jerked as it touched down on the surface, its landing gear scraping against the planet's uneven ground. The ship's engines powered down, and a sharp silence fell over the crew. Zaruna rose from her seat, her posture stiff, her mind clearing of all distractions. She could no longer afford the luxury of doubt. The mission was clear. The humans were the enemy. She led the team into the bustling human outpost, her every step deliberate. The planet's dust clung to her boots, a reminder of the untamed world she had arrived on. The walls of the outpost were made of scrap metal and makeshift materials, nothing like the pristine, imposing structures of the Solvrian Empire. This was an environment born of necessity, not elegance. The humans here had no illusions about their survival. Their once proud military had been reduced to a ragtag group of civilians and soldiers, doing what they could to hold on to their fragile lives. They weren't warriors in the grand sense, but Zaruna had come to respect their resilience. It was this very resilience that made the betrayal she had delivered even more difficult to bear. Mark had been one of the first to reach out to her, his quiet intelligence drawing her in. Their conversations had started innocuously enough, about nothing in particular. Yet somehow they had found common ground in the oddest of places. His kindness, his willingness to listen, to understand the things that no one else seemed to care about, had touched something deep within her. Something she hadn't realized was there, until it was too late. She couldn't afford to think about that now. She couldn't afford to think about Mark at all. The transmission crackled again in her earpiece, her mind snapping back to the present. Blockade initiated, proceeding with the operation. Understood, she replied, her voice cold as she activated the communication system to deliver the final coordinates. She stood there, her mind warring with itself, but her body moved automatically. She had been trained for moments like this. As the first shots rang out in the distance, Zaruna's thoughts were far from the battlefield. She wasn't just betraying an outpost. She was betraying a man, a memory, and that, she realized with a sickening clarity, was the most dangerous thing she had ever done. Years had passed and Zaruna had risen within the ranks of the Solvrian Empire, her name spoken with reverence and fear in equal measure. She had become a symbol of her people's power, a living testament to the cold, efficient will of the Empire. Yet in the quiet moments between battles, when her mind wandered far from the mission, it was Mark's face that haunted her, his laughter, his voice, the way he'd looked at her, as though he could see her, really see her, beyond the armor and the hardened shell she had so carefully built around herself. She had tried to bury those memories under layers of duty and responsibility, but they had a way of resurfacing, like a nagging itch that couldn't be scratched. In the heart of the Solvrian fleet, Zaruna stood on the command bridge of her flagship, staring out into the endless void of space. The stars flickered before her, cold and distant, like forgotten dreams. Her mind, however, was not on the mission at hand. Instead, it was on the image of the human she had once betrayed. Mark. She had done it for the Empire. She had done it because it was what was expected of her. But deep down, she knew that she had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The weight of that decision pressed heavily on her chest, even now when the war was so far from over. Commander Zaruna, a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Officer Kanar, her most trusted subordinate, standing at attention before her, a datapad in hand. The human fleet is in range. They're about to engage. Zaruna blinked, her gaze snapping back to the present. The human forces had been growing in strength, their resistance becoming more coordinated, more effective. It was no longer the ragtag collection of civilians and soldiers she had seen so long ago. These humans were a threat, and that threat needed to be neutralized once and for all. But even as she gave the orders to prepare for battle, a small, stubborn part of her wondered if Mark was still out there, somewhere, fighting against her. Are the ships ready? She asked, her voice steady, though there was an edge to it now, an unmistakable sharpness. Yes, Commander, Kinar replied. We will launch the first strike in 15 minutes. Zaruna nodded, turning her attention to the display in front of her. The human fleet loomed large on the screens, a motley array of ships that looked as though they had been assembled with whatever scrap metal they could find. Still, there was an undeniable resilience to them. Zaruna couldn't help but admire it, even if she couldn't allow herself to show it. As the countdown began, she leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. The thought of Mark, the thought of him leading the human forces, gnawed at her. She could almost hear his voice again, like an echo from another life. You know, Zaruna, there's a better way to do this. We don't have to be enemies. She had laughed at him then, not out of cruelty, but out of disbelief. Who was this man, this human, to talk about peace when the galaxy was engulfed in war? He had no idea what it meant to stand on the precipice of total victory, to feel the power of the Solvrian Empire at your back. But now, years later, she found herself questioning the very ideals she had once held so firmly. Was it possible to find peace in a universe built on bloodshed and conquest? Commander, the human ships are locking onto us. Kinar's voice brought her back to reality. We're ready to strike. Zaruna took a deep breath. There was no time for second-guessing. The mission was clear. The fleet would destroy the human forces, and the war would continue, as it always had. Yet as the first wave of attacks launched, something unexpected happened. The human fleet, though vastly outnumbered, fought with a tenacity that was almost familiar. As the explosions ripped through the vastness of space, Zaruna couldn't help but smile, albeit faintly. They've gotten better, she muttered under her breath. Kinar shot her a curious glance. Pardon, Commander. Nothing, she replied quickly, shaking her head. Just keep your focus. We're not done yet. But the human fleet wasn't going down without a fight. The battle dragged on, longer than Zaruna had anticipated. The human ships, though smaller and less advanced, were cunning. They dodged, they wove through the chaos of the battlefield, and they had a surprising amount of firepower hidden beneath their worn-out hulls. It was almost as if they had learned from their past mistakes. As the battle raged, Zaruna's thoughts flickered back to that fateful day, years ago, when she had made the choice that had shattered everything. Don't make this harder than it has to be, she whispered to herself, though she knew no one would hear. It wasn't long before a familiar signal appeared on her communications panel. It was a human ship broadcasting on a secure frequency. Zaruna's heart skipped a beat. She recognized that signature, a signature she had hoped to never see again. Zaruna, came a voice over the comms. It was calm, almost too calm, and undeniably familiar. I never thought I'd hear from you again. Not after everything that happened. Her stomach dropped. She straightened, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the holographic display. Mark's face appeared on the screen, his features lined with age and the strain of battle, but his eyes, the same eyes that had once looked at her with such understanding, remained unchanged. You're still alive, Zaruna said, her voice betraying a mix of disbelief and something else, something she couldn't quite name. Mark's smile was soft, tinged with something that might have been sadness, or maybe it was just weariness. Last time I checked, he replied. You've been busy, I see. The tension in Zaruna's chest flared again, but she pushed it down. She had no time for this. The war was still happening, and she couldn't afford to lose herself in the past. I won't make this a long conversation, she said, her tone now cold and professional. We will finish this. There's no room for mercy now. Mark's smile faded, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though he was searching for the right words. Zaruna, you don't have to do this. It doesn't have to end like this. Her hand twitched, her fingers almost reaching for the controls that would end the transmission. But then she stopped herself, the vulnerability in his voice. It was almost unbearable. Why, Mark? She asked quietly, her voice betraying the conflict she had long suppressed. Why are you still trying to reach out to me, after everything I've done? Mark's eyes softened, the lines of battle fading into the background as he spoke. Because I know you, Zaruna. And I know that the person you were, the person I knew, would never let this war define who you are. There's still a chance for you to change. For both of us. The words hung in the air between them like a delicate thread, fragile and fraying. Zaruna didn't know what to say. She couldn't. There was nothing to say that would undo the past. But somehow, the weight of his forgiveness, of his unshakable belief in her, made everything feel possible. You're wasting your time, Zaruna said, her voice cracking slightly. You'll be dead before you can change anything. We both might be, Mark replied, his voice steady despite the odds. But if there's even a sliver of hope, then I'll hold on to it. For both of us. Zaruna closed her eyes, the battle continuing around her. She had once been a soldier of the Empire. She had once been certain. But now, with Mark's voice in her ear, everything was different. She didn't know what to do. She only knew one thing. The universe was changing, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to change with it. The battle had raged for hours, the stars themselves seeming to recoil as blasts of energy tore through the fabric of space. Zaruna stood on the command deck of her ship, her fingers curled tightly around the rail in front of her. The human fleet was still holding strong, defying every expectation. She could feel the tension in the air, the hum of the ship's systems in sync with the pulse of her own heartbeat. It had been so easy to fall into the rhythm of war, to believe that the victory of the Solvrian Empire was a foregone conclusion. So simple to disregard everything that came before. The ideals, the humanity. But now, as the war dragged on and Mark's voice echoed in her mind, Zaruna found herself questioning everything. She had never been one to entertain such weakness, but today, as the universe seemed to close in around her, she felt something stirring inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The comm system buzzed, and Zaruna's attention snapped to the screen. Mark's face, worn with the scars of battle, appeared once more. Despite the harsh lines of war etched into his features, there was a softness in his eyes that sent a jolt through her chest. For a moment, it was as though no time had passed. It was just the two of them, standing on a battlefield, with the fate of the galaxy in the balance. "Zaruna," Mark said, his voice steady, though tinged with the same sorrow it had carried years ago. "I've been thinking a lot about this, about everything, and I've come to a conclusion." Zaruna didn't respond immediately. She was silent, watching him, feeling the weight of everything she had done, everything she had become. It wasn't just the war, it was the betrayal, the coldness she had wrapped herself in, the empire she had sworn to serve, and the man she had left behind. "You're still fighting for the wrong side, Mark," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted this. Not really." Mark smiled, that same quiet, understanding smile that had once made her heart race. "I know, but it's not too late to change, Zaruna. You know that, don't you?" Her throat tightened and she turned away from the screen. She couldn't look at him anymore. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. "I don't know how to stop this," she muttered, her voice raw with uncertainty. "I don't know how to fix it." "You don't have to fix everything," Mark's voice responded. "You just have to do what you know is right." She felt the words sink into her, like a slow burn that spread through her chest. Mark wasn't asking for her to make grand gestures, or for her to save the galaxy in one swoop. He was simply asking her to remember who she was, to find her way back to herself. The transmission cut out abruptly, and Zaruna was left alone with her thoughts. Her gaze drifted to the holographic map of the battlefield, and she could almost hear the distant hum of the human fleet, still holding on. She knew what she had to do. "I have to stop this," she whispered to herself. "I have to end it. For good." She turned toward her crew, all of them standing at attention, awaiting her orders. They had no idea what was going through her mind. To them, she was still the commander, the cold, ruthless leader who had led them to victory after victory. They had no idea that everything was about to change. "Prepare to disengage the fleet," Zaruna said, her voice firm, but without the usual edge of authority. "I'm calling for a ceasefire." The crew exchanged confused glances, but no one spoke out. They had learned long ago that their commander's decisions, however strange, were always final. "Commander, are you certain?" Kinar asked, stepping forward with a furrowed brow. "The human fleet is still a threat. I'm certain," Zaruna interrupted, her eyes locking with his. "It ends now. I won't be the one to carry this war any longer." She turned back to the communication system, sending out a signal to the human fleet, her heart pounding in her chest. It felt surreal, this moment of vulnerability, of exposure. But it was also a moment of power. She was choosing her own path, no longer shackled by the expectations of the Empire. Within moments, the response came, crackling through the comm system. Mark's voice, full of hope, filled the room. We've received your signal, Zaruna. It's over then? Yes, Zaruna replied, her voice steady. It's over. The war didn't end with a single victory or a grand gesture. There were no explosions or dramatic showdowns. Instead, it ended with quiet resolve, a decision made not in the heat of battle, but in the heart. The ceasefire was called. The two fleets, once poised to destroy each other, now stood at a tenuous peace, the air heavy with the weight of everything they had lost and everything they could still save. In the days that followed, Zaruna found herself on a small, nameless world, far from the empire she had served and the people she had betrayed. It was a simple place, untouched by war, and it gave her a moment to breathe, to reflect. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of it. She met with Mark again, in the same quiet way they always had. This time, there was no battlefield between them, no armor, just two people, trying to make sense of the pieces they had left. You were right, she said softly, looking at him across the table. It wasn't too late to change. Mark smiled, his eyes kind and forgiving. I never doubted you, Zaruna. Zaruna couldn't help but chuckle. You should have. I'm terrible at this. He laughed too, the sound easy and warm, like a bond that had never truly broken. For a moment, they were just two people, sitting together in the quiet after the storm, the weight of the universe forgotten. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Zaruna allowed herself to believe that there might be a future, one not shaped by war or duty, but by something else, something simpler, something worth fighting for. The stars outside the window still twinkled with a cold, indifferent light, but inside, where the past and future converged, there was warmth, there was hope, and there was, perhaps for the first time, peace.